She was only a maid, but she saved the twins from the Duke's neglect in a way no one imagined. I have served in Ravenshollow Castle since I was barely more than a girl, but in all my years, I have never known silence as heavy as the silence that followed the Duchess's death. The day she left this world, giving her last breath to bring forth her children, the castle itself seemed to darken. The banners still hung, the fires still burned, the halls were still swept clean. Yet something vital was gone, and we who remained learned to live within that void. The Duke buried himself in his duties. From dawn until deep into the night, he sat among scrolls and seals, or rode with his men across the hunting grounds. His footsteps rarely echoed near the nursery. When they did, it was only in passing. Never long enough for his children to run to him. Never long enough for them to press their small hands into his. He was not unkind, but he was absent. And absence, I learned, wounds deeper than cruelty. It was I who raised the twins from their first cries. Adrian and Seraphine, born on a storm-tossed night, grew with startling speed and brilliance. At 5 years old, they could already read passages from the Psalms and recite verses their mother had once loved. Adrian's mind was sharp as a blade, curious about everything. He dismantled toys to see how they worked, questioned why the stars moved across the sky, begged for ink and parchment to practice his letters. Seraphine, with her mother's soft eyes, painted words into poetry, sang when she thought no one listened, and soothed her brother when he grew restless. They should have been celebrated, admired, cherished. But too often I saw them standing at the tall windows, watching their father ride out with his men, their small hands pressed against the cold glass, whispering, "Will he look for us today?" He never did. It was not only his absence that hurt them, it was the whispers. Servants, foolish and cruel, thinking children too young to understand, would mutter as they passed. They are the very image of her. No wonder he keeps away. They remind him of what he lost. Perhaps he resents them. Perhaps he sees the blood price of her death each time he looks at them. I tried to shield the twins from such poison, but their ears were keen. One evening I found Seraphine curled beneath her blanket, whispering to her brother, "Do you think we killed her?" My heart broke at those words. I gathered them both in my arms and told them the truth, that their mother had given her life out of love, not because of them, never because of them. But how could I erase the doubts planted by careless tongues? Every day, they grew more aware. Adrian grew quieter, holding his questions inside instead of sharing them. Seraphine stopped singing, her voice caught in her throat, as though afraid it would betray her longing. And still, the Duke did not see. Perhaps he believed they were too young to notice his absence, or perhaps he thought duty and provision were enough. But I, who dried their tears, who heard their whispered prayers at night, knew the truth. They did not want riches or servants or fine clothes. They wanted their father, and I, God forgive me, I began to resent him for it, not because he was cruel, but because he was blind. How could a man command knights, manage estates, and negotiate treaties, yet fail to see the pain in his own children's eyes? That was when I began to feel the stirring of courage in me. I was no lady, no noble with power or voice in court. I was only a maid, a nursemaid at that. But I had held those children since the hour of their birth, and I loved them as fiercely as if they were mine. If no one else would speak for them, then I would. Even if it cost me my place, I would tell the Duke the truth, that his heirs were not cursed, nor burdens, nor shadows of the past. They were living, breathing children who ached for his love. And if he did not act soon, the ache would turn into a wound no amount of duty could heal. I had rehearsed the words 100 times in the quiet of the nursery, whispering them as I folded linens or stirred the children's porridge. Yet when the moment came, my knees trembled. The Duke was not a man easily approached, even by his closest advisors. To enter his study unbidden was to risk dismissal. but I could no longer bear to watch Adrian press his little face against the window every morning, hoping his father would glance up from the courtyard. I could no longer stand the way Seraphine asked in hushed tones if her papa disliked the sound of her voice. So one evening, when the children had fallen asleep and the corridors were empty, I gathered my courage and walked toward the heavy oak doors of his study. The firelight flickered beneath the crack, and the scent of wax and ink reached me before I even knocked. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to rap on the door. "Enter." His voice was deep, clipped, the voice of a man always in command. I pushed the door open, stepping inside as quietly as I could. The study was lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes. A great map of his territories spread across the table where he sat, quill in hand. He did not look up immediately. Only when I curtsied and stood in silence did he lift his gaze. "What is it?" he asked, more weary than unkind. "My lord." My voice wavered. I steadied it, thinking of Adrian's solemn eyes, of Seraphine's whispered doubts. "It is about the children." That caught his attention, the quill stilled in his hand, and his eyes, so piercing and so cold, fixed on me. "Are they unwell?" "No, my lord," I said quickly. "Not in body, but in spirit." I faltered. His brow furrowed. I pressed on. "They believe you do not care for them." The words fell like stones into the silence. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "What nonsense is this?" "It is no nonsense, my lord. They wait at the windows for you. They beg for your attention, your praise, your smile, and when it does not come, they ask me if you hate them, if they remind you too much of the Duchess. They have heard the whispers, my lord. Servants who speak without thought. They think themselves unseen, but the children hear, and they suffer." For a moment he said nothing. His eyes had hardened, but not with anger, rather with something I had never seen in him before: pain. "Who dares speak such things?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Too many, my lord. I cannot silence every tongue in the castle, but it is not the whispers that wound them most. It is your silence. They are only 5 years old, my lord. They do not understand duty or grief. They understand only that their father does not come when they call." The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the heavy pause that followed. He set the quill aside, his hands clasping tightly before him as if to keep them steady. For the first time, I saw a crack in the armor he wore so well. "You think I do not love them?" His voice was quiet now, stripped of its usual command. "I think you do not know how to show it," I replied, my courage trembling but unbroken. "And I think they will grow believing you never did, unless something changes." His jaw tightened, but he did not rebuke me. Instead, he rose from his chair and walked to the tall window, staring out into the dark courtyard. His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost. "They are her image," he murmured, so softly I almost missed it. "Every glance is a blade to the heart. I buried myself in work because it was easier than facing what I lost. I thought providing for them would be enough." "Provision is not love, my lord," I said gently. "They do not need jewels or tutors. They need their father." He turned then, and for the first time in 5 years, his eyes looked almost human. Not the polished steel of a ruler, but the weary, haunted gaze of a man who realized how much he had failed. "I did not know," he whispered. "God forgive me. I did not know." In that moment, I saw resolve harden in his face. The Duke of Ravenshollow was not a man who lingered in hesitation once a truth had been laid bare. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his cloak sweeping behind him. "The names of those who spread such poison, I want them. Tomorrow they will be dismissed, every last one of them." "My lord." I curtsied again, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of relief and fear. The children need you more than vengeance against servants." "And they shall have me," he said firmly. "From this night on, they will not be left to doubt it." I left the study trembling, not from fear, but from hope. For the first time, I believed that the silence which had suffocated the castle for 5 years might finally begin to break. The morning after my bold confession, the castle stirred with unease. Servants whispered that the Duke had dismissed several men and women without explanation, their trunks sent rolling down the steps before the sun had risen. It was swift, merciless, and it sent a clear message: no one would speak against the twins again. Yet the children knew nothing of this. What they did notice was far stranger, that their father appeared at breakfast. It had been years since he had sat at the long oak table where the children dined. Usually, their meals were shared with me or with tutors, the Duke preferring the solitude of his study or the company of his council. But that morning, as the twins picked at their bread and honey, the heavy doors opened, and there he was. Adrian froze, his small hand still clutching a crust of bread. Seraphine blinked as though unsure she was not dreaming. I curtsied, keeping my eyes lowered, though my heart hammered in my chest. "My lord," I murmured. The Duke inclined his head slightly, then pulled out a chair at the head of the table. He did not speak at first, simply sat, his cloak settling around him like a dark wave. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The twins stared at him, waiting. He cleared his throat. "Have you eaten well?" It was such a simple question, yet it landed like thunder. Adrian swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, Papa." His voice was small but steady. Seraphine clutched her spoon tightly, whispering, "We missed you." The Duke's hand tightened around his goblet. For a heartbeat, he seemed unable to answer. Then, with effort, he said, "I have missed you too." The words were halting, but they were true. I saw Seraphine's eyes brighten, though she lowered them quickly, as if afraid to hope too much. That day marked the beginning of his attempts. They were clumsy, yes, but earnest. He began appearing at odd hours, standing in the doorway of the nursery, as though unsure how to step inside. Once, I found him lingering in the library, where Adrian practiced his letters, pretending to examine a map, while his son read aloud with quiet pride. Another time, he paused in the garden where Seraphine played with her wooden dolls, his gaze softening when she sang the lullaby her mother had once loved. The children, however, were cautious. Adrian, sharp-minded, looked at his father with suspicion. He had learned too young that hope often led to disappointment. He answered questions politely, but did not yet open his heart. Seraphine was gentler, more eager to forgive, yet even she hesitated to run into his arms. They had lived too long in the shadow of his absence. It would take more than a few words to convince them he meant to stay. One evening, I witnessed the first true breakthrough. Adrian had been struggling with a puzzle of wooden pieces, trying to fit them into a box. He grew frustrated, his small fists pounding the table. The Duke entered just then, his presence filling the room. Adrian stiffened, hiding the puzzle behind him as though ashamed. "What are you working on?" the Duke asked. "Nothing," Adrian muttered, but the Duke knelt beside him, lowering himself until his eyes were level with his son's. "May I see?" Hesitant, Adrian pushed the box toward him. The Duke studied it for a moment, then took a piece in his large hand. "This one goes here," he said, sliding it into place. Adrian's eyes widened, then narrowed. "How did you know?" The Duke allowed the faintest of smiles. "I used to play with one just like it when I was your age." Silence hung between them. Then Adrian whispered, "So you were a boy once too?" A quiet chuckle escaped the Duke's lips, rusty from disuse. "Yes, a very stubborn one, if you can believe it." Adrian's laughter, soft, surprised, genuine, rang through the nursery. It was the first time in years I had heard such a sound in his father's presence. Seraphine clapped her hands in delight, as if sensing the fragile bridge being built. That night, as I tucked the children into bed, Seraphine whispered, "Do you think Papa will come again tomorrow?" "Yes, little dove," I told her. "I think he will." And for the first time, I truly believed it. The days that followed felt like the slow thaw of winter. For years, the nursery had been a world apart, filled with laughter and learning, but shut away from the man whose presence mattered most. Now, little by little, the Duke stepped across that threshold. He was still cautious, still uncertain, but the children began to notice. And though they pretended indifference at times, I could see the way their eyes searched for him whenever footsteps echoed down the corridor. It was Adrian who tested him first. One afternoon, the boy spread parchment across the nursery table, carefully scratching letters with a quill far too large for his small hand. When the Duke entered, Adrian stiffened, ready to cover his work. But instead of retreating, his father moved closer. "What are you writing?" he asked. "A list," Adrian replied curtly. The Duke raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Adrian hesitated, then pushed the parchment forward. "Of everything I want to learn." I peered over his shoulder. The list, written in shaky but determined script, read, "Stars, swords, numbers, castles, horses, why Papa is always busy." The Duke stared at the page for a long moment. His jaw tightened, but he did not look away. Instead, he sat at the table, his large hand steadying the quill as Adrian dipped it in ink again. "Very well," he said. "Which shall we begin with?" Adrian's eyes lit up, though he tried to hide his excitement. "Stars." That night, I watched from the doorway as father and son leaned together over the window ledge, the Duke pointing out constellations with a patience I had never thought him capable of. Adrian listened intently, repeating the names, his voice full of awe. And for once, the Duke did not look at his son with pain, but with pride. Seraphine, not to be outdone, made her own attempt the following day. She had been practicing verses in secret, whispering them into the corners of the nursery when she thought no one heard. When her father entered, she stood tall, her small chin lifted. "Papa, may I recite something for you?" The Duke blinked, taken aback, but nodded. Seraphine clasped her hands before her and spoke with a clarity beyond her years. "The rose may fade, the night may fall, but love endures, it conquers all. Though sorrow cuts, though silence grieves, the heart remembers and believes." The room grew still. The Duke's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. He crouched before her, his voice low. "Where did you learn that?" "I wrote it," she whispered. "For Mama." Something in him broke then. He gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that stunned us all. Seraphine pressed her face into his shoulder, smiling through her tears, and Adrian watched in silence, his guarded heart softening at last. From that moment, the change was undeniable. The Duke no longer lingered at the edges. He entered fully into their lives. He began eating meals with them, listening to their chatter about dolls and wooden swords. He asked questions, real questions, and when they answered, he listened. And in turn, he discovered what I had always known, that these were no ordinary children. Adrian's mind raced ahead of his years. He understood numbers with an ease that baffled even the steward. Seraphine had a gift for words, weaving emotions into poetry that left even the tutors speechless. They were not simply children. They were echoes of the Duchess's brilliance, living proof that her spirit had not died with her body. One evening, after the twins had fallen asleep, the Duke remained in the nursery, watching them breathe. His voice was quiet when he spoke to me. I thought I was sparing myself by keeping away. but it is they who have paid the price." "They only wanted you, my lord," I replied softly. "Not your wealth, not your power, only you." He nodded slowly, as if the weight of those words pressed into his very soul. "I see it now, and God help me, I will not fail them again." Change in a great house does not come quietly. When the Duke first sat with his children at breakfast, the servants whispered. When he knelt in the nursery to study Adrian's puzzles, or listened to Seraphine's verses, the whispers grew louder. But as the days turned into weeks, the gossip faltered. Actions speak louder than rumors, and the Duke's actions were undeniable. He began by claiming small moments. At first, they seemed insignificant. Walking the twins to the stables, watching as Adrian attempted to brush the mane of a pony too large for his hands, or standing by as Seraphine scattered crumbs for the doves in the courtyard. But soon those moments grew into habits. The children, once timid in his presence, started seeking him out. They would rush to the door when they heard his boots in the hall, tugging at his cloak with eager questions. One morning, I found him in the training yard, a wooden sword in hand, facing his son. Adrian's small body was taut with concentration, mimicking every move his father demonstrated. The Duke's voice, stern yet patient, carried across the yard. "Not strength, Adrian. Balance. A man who strikes wildly will lose before the fight has even begun." Adrian nodded fiercely, determination etched into his face. When he managed to copy the stance correctly, the Duke's lips curved into something rare. A smile, faint but proud. That evening, Seraphine tugged at her father's hand, pulling him toward the music room. I followed discreetly, watching as she placed a sheet of parchment on the stand. "Sing with me, Papa." His eyes widened, as if the request were impossible. "I do not sing," he murmured. "You can try," she insisted, her small hands on her hips. There was her mother in her then, soft but unyielding. To my astonishment, he did try. His deep voice stumbled over the melody at first, but Seraphine's laughter smoothed the edges. Together, their voices filled the chamber, hers bright and clear, his low and hesitant, yet somehow they blended. I had never heard the Duke sound so alive. The castle itself seemed to awaken with them. Where once corridors echoed with silence, now they rang with childish laughter and the rumble of a father's voice. Servants who had once muttered of curses now looked away in shame, their eyes softening when they passed the nursery. No one dared speak ill of the twins again, not after the Duke had dismissed those who had tried. But the most striking change was not in the castle, but in the man himself. The Duke, who had once been nothing but duty and iron, began to soften in ways that startled even him. I saw it in the way he bent down to wipe a smear of ink from Adrian's cheek, or the way he carried Seraphine on his shoulders through the gardens, her giggles spilling into the sunlight. He was not only present, he was learning to be vulnerable. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, I found him sitting by the hearth, a toy horse in his hand. It was Adrian's, carved from wood, its leg broken. The Duke was whittling a new piece, his large hands surprisingly gentle with the small figure. "You surprise me, my lord," I said softly. He looked up, almost sheepish. "I do not know how to mend what I have broken here," he admitted, "but I can mend this." He set the toy aside, his gaze drifting toward the nursery. "They are cleverer than I ever imagined. Adrian's mind, Seraphine's words. They frighten me sometimes, not because they are lacking, but because they are more than I know how to guide." "You need not be perfect," I told him. "You need only be present. The rest, they will teach you as much as you teach them." He fell silent, but his eyes softened with something I had long prayed to see: acceptance. The weeks passed and the bond grew. The twins no longer asked if their father loved them. They knew. Adrian walked taller, his small shoulders squared with pride, Seraphine sang more freely, her voice echoing down the halls like sunlight made sound. And the Duke, though still carrying the shadow of his grief, began to walk lighter, as though the burden was no longer his alone to bear. And I, who had once feared I would carry the children's pain with me to my grave, began to believe I might at last carry peace instead. The spring festival had always been a time of splendor, yet in past years it had felt more like a performance than a celebration. The halls of Ravenshollow would be dressed with banners, the tables laden with roasted meats and candied fruits, the air filled with the sounds of minstrels. Nobles from near and far gathered to flatter or conspire, raising their goblets to the Duke while whispering about his supposed coldness behind the safety of silk fans. But this year was different. From the moment the trumpets sounded, a hush fell over the crowd. The great doors swung open, and into the hall stepped the Duke. Not alone, not grim and shrouded in solitude, but with a child at each side. Adrian walked tall, his small hand gripping his father's firmly, his other hand tucked behind his back, with the solemnity of a boy already imagining himself a knight. Seraphine skipped lightly at the Duke's other side, her curls catching the torchlight, her eyes sparkling with pride. The hall erupted with whispers. Some gasped outright. For years, the children had been hidden away, mentioned in passing but never seen at their father's side. And now, here they were, heirs not in rumor, but in flesh, alive and radiant, clinging to the hand of a man who once seemed incapable of acknowledging them. "This is my blood," the Duke said, his voice carrying across the hall, silencing every murmur. "My heirs, my pride, my light." I stood among the servants at the edge of the chamber, my heart swelling so fiercely I thought it might break. I had imagined this moment countless times, prayed for it, begged heaven for it. But even my imagination had not prepared me for the sight of the Duke of Ravenshollow holding his children before the eyes of every noble in the realm. Lord Hadrian, whose whispers had long sought to undermine the children's place, paled visibly. Lady Corvina, who once dared call them cursed, lowered her fan and bowed her head. Others who had doubted or gossiped fell into silence, unwilling to challenge the truth proclaimed so openly. It was not just words, it was a vow. From that day forward, life in Ravenshollow Castle changed in ways that reached every corner of its stone walls. The Duke no longer retreated into his study at dawn to emerge only at nightfall. Instead, he sought the company of his children in the early hours. I often found him in the stables with Adrian, teaching him the names of the horses, showing him how to hold the reins with confidence rather than force. Adrian's laughter rang through the yard as his father lifted him onto a pony, steadying his small frame with surprising gentleness. The boy had once feared his father's shadow. Now he sought it eagerly, walking beside him as though trying to match his stride. With Seraphine, the bond blossomed differently. She adored poetry and song, and though the Duke's voice was rough, he never refused her when she tugged at his sleeve and demanded, "Sing with me, Papa." At first, his notes were hesitant, almost embarrassed, but Seraphine's joy was infectious, her giggles turning his reluctance into laughter. Soon their voices blended in the music room, her light soprano dancing above his deep baritone, filling the castle with a harmony it had never known. And when night fell, he no longer left them to my care alone. He sat at their bedside, telling stories in a voice that carried both strength and sorrow. Sometimes he spoke of battles and kings, but more often he spoke of their mother, of the way she laughed when she rode, of the way her hands could coax beauty from the simplest of gardens, of the way her voice softened even his hardest days. He had once avoided her memory for fear it would undo him. Now he shared it with his children, teaching them not to fear the shadow of her absence but to carry the light of her presence. The servants, too, felt the change. Where once they whispered cruelly, now they fell silent in shame. Some of those who had spread poison were gone, dismissed by the Duke without ceremony. Those who remained began to soften, their eyes gentler when the children passed, their greetings warmer. The castle itself seemed to breathe again, no longer a tomb of silence, but a home. It was not only within the walls that the transformation was felt. Word spread quickly through the villages and towns. Merchants who once bowed stiffly now brought small trinkets for the twins, laying them at the castle gates in gestures of respect. Villagers spoke proudly of their duke, who had reclaimed not only his duty but his heart. Even the knights, hardened men of war, began to show a new deference. I saw it the day Seraphine wandered into the training yard, clutching a flower crown she had woven. She offered it shyly to one of the knights, who laughed and placed it atop his helm. The Duke, watching from the sidelines, did not chastise him. Instead, he laughed too, a sound so rare that the men straightened with pride, as though blessed by their lord's joy. For me, these changes were more than outward displays. They were answers to prayers whispered in the lonely hours of the night. I had carried the children's sorrow for years, borne their whispered fears that their father despised them. I had shielded them from cruel tongues, comforted them when they wept, told them again and again that they were loved, even when they doubted it. Now I no longer carried that burden alone. Their father had claimed it, as he should have from the beginning. Yet even as peace settled over the castle, one truth lingered. Grief does not vanish. The Duke still carried it. I saw it in his eyes sometimes, in the way he paused when Seraphine tilted her head just like her mother, or when Adrian's laughter echoed a sound he had not heard since before that storm-tossed night. But now he carried it differently, no longer as a chain binding him to sorrow, but as a thread weaving the past into the present. One evening, I found him alone in the chapel, the children asleep and the halls quiet. A single candle burned before the Duchess's tomb. He stood with his hands clasped, his head bowed. I did not intrude, but I heard his voice, low and steady. I failed them for too long, but I will not fail them again. They are yours, and they are mine. Through them, you live still. I left him to his prayers, my heart heavy, yet light at once. For in that vow, I knew he had found peace. The final proof came on a night much like the one that had once changed everything. A storm rolling over the hills, rain lashing against the shutters. Thunder shook the nursery as the twins clung to their father, who sat between their beds, telling them stories until they drifted into sleep. I stood in the doorway, watching as his hand smoothed their hair, his voice steady against the storm. No fear lingered in them now. No doubts. As I turned to leave, the Duke looked up, his eyes meeting mine. For the first time, he did not look at me as a servant, but as something more. "You gave them what I could not," he said quietly. "You gave them love when I could not see. For that, I owe you more than I can repay." I curtsied, but my voice was steady. "You owe me nothing, my lord. It was never mine to give. It was always yours. You only had to see it." He inclined his head, and I left the nursery with tears in my eyes. Years may pass, and the children will grow, but I will remember these days. The days when laughter returned to Ravenshollow, when a grieving man learned to be a father, when two small souls were given back the love they had always deserved. And as for me, I will carry no regret. For I have fulfilled the duty I was given, not only to raise them, but to help them reclaim the father they thought lost. The Duke of Ravenshollow will be remembered by history as a stern lord, a strong ruler, perhaps even a fearsome man. But I will remember him as something far greater, a father kneeling in a nursery, whispering to his children that they were his pride, his light, his life, and that, more than any crown or conquest, is a legacy worth leaving.